The hidden money masters who chose the kings. Credit, sovereignty, and the making of kings. Thesis and scope. You examine how crowns were secured by credit as much as by conquest. The central claim is that lenders, merchants, and banking houses acted as kingmakers by advancing funds that sustained armies, arranged marriages, and stabilized courts. You read royal authority as contingent on solvency, with coronations resting on ledgers and bond contracts as much as on bloodlines or blessing. This view reframes sovereignty as a financial capacity grounded in legal instruments that allocate risk, priority, and control. Footnote. This section states that you must analyze kingship through credit and legal capacity rather than through warfare alone. Mechanisms of financial power. You trace how advances, guarantees, and tax farms created leverage over rulers. When you follow the money, you find letters of exchange, pledges of future revenue, and liens on customs as the quiet architecture of rule. Bankers set covenants that condition policy, priced war, and rationed peace. In practice, you see a principal and agent problem. The monarch seeks funds now and promises streams later. The financier prices enforcement through jurisdiction, collateral, and reputation. Sovereignty lives or dies on that pricing. Footnote. This section shows how legal and financial instruments translated private credit into public power. Florence and the Medici. You use Renaissance Florence to see how a banking dynasty turned credit into office. By extending funds to princes and to the papal court, the Medici converted risk into rank and soft power into hard appointments. You note that lending and campaigns bought influence when swords fell silent. In effect, you witness a feedback loop. Credit funded force and force protected credit. The family's ascent demonstrates that controlling payments infrastructure can outrun any army and shaping succession. Footnote. This section uses Florence to illustrate how a banking house converted finance into enduring political authority. England and Florentine credit. You analyze the 100 Years' War through balance sheets. The English crown relied on Italian houses for advances against future revenue. When a king defaulted in the 14th century, Florentine giants failed, revealing bilateral fragility. You learn two lessons. First, a ruler's breach can crash creditors and reorder markets. Second, creditor panic can discipline rulers by raising future borrowing costs or closing markets entirely. Neither side is fully sovereign once promises are sold. Footnote. This section explains how royal default exposed mutual dependence between crowns and creditors. Networks in the 19th century. You examine how a transnational banking family used branch networks and information speed to underwrite states and choose winners. By financing coalitions during European wars and managing sovereign placements across capitals, the house turned time into advantage. Early knowledge of outcomes and rapid settlement capacity became a private clearing system that stabilized allies and isolated opponents. You see how syndication and market making let a bank outvote a throne without firing a shot. Footnote. This section highlights how a cross-border banking network translated speed and syndication into geopolitical influence. Ottoman sarrafs and imperial cash flow. You study the Ottoman court's dependence on financiers who advanced pay for troops and officials. These lenders, often drawn from minority communities, managed coin supply, farmed revenues, and bridged fiscal gaps in exchange for access and protection. Their withdrawal could stall garrisons and trigger palace shifts. You infer a core rule. Where bureaucracies are vast and tax collection is uneven, private treasurers become indispensable and thus politically powerful. Footnote. This section shows how court financiers in an empire converted cash management into leverage over policy and succession. France and the limits of spectacle. You look past palaces to ledgers in the Ancien regime. Continuous war and display required continuous finance. Tax farmers and projectors devised innovations that monetized future claims and inflated expectations. A famous trading scheme boomed then crashed, proving that speculation can mask insolvency only for a season. By the late 18th century, mounting arrears to financiers constrained the crown's choices and helped set the stage for systemic rupture. Footnote. This section argues that persistent reliance on private finance in France turned fiscal strain into political collapse. Hedging across regime change. You observe that prudent money masters rarely bet on one claimant. They lent to rivals, secured claims on customs rather than on persons, and documented priority across potential regimes. By diversifying counterparties and insisting on portable security, they survived coups, restorations, and revolutions. You learn to read durability as a legal design choice. The better the paper, the safer the dynasty behind it. Footnote. This section explains how financiers use diversification and portable security to endure regime shifts. Modern legacy. You translate the pattern into the present. Governments rely on central banks, sovereign bond markets, and international creditors to roll obligations and buffer shocks. Today, rating actions, benchmark inclusion, and collateral frameworks can crown or constrain leaders. The idiom changes from chanceries to clearinghouses, yet the rule persists. Fiscal capacity is constitutional in effect. Without credible access to funding at tolerable spreads, policy becomes theater and tenure short. Footnote. This section links historical kingmaking by credit to contemporary dependence on monetary and bond market institutions. Implications for legal analysis. You treat sovereignty as a contract problem. Public law meets private law in debt covenants, tax assignments, and enforcement forums. You evaluate remedies that creditors wield, from acceleration to attachment, and weigh immunities that states claim. You ask how constitutions allocate borrowing authority and how courts police ultra vires debt. You conclude that legitimacy rests not only on consent but on capacity to pay without mortgaging the polity's future beyond recall. Footnote. This section urges you to analyze kingship and state power through contract design, remedies, and constitutional allocation of fiscal authority. Conclusion. Ledger behind throne. You return to the thesis. Behind every crown sits a ledger. The actors change from Florentine rooms to global desks, yet the dependency endures. When you study rule through finance, you see that the right to govern is a function of the means to pay. The money masters did not merely observe history. They wrote it in account books, deciding who could afford to reign and for how long. Footnote. This section closes by affirming that control of money has long controlled kingship and still shapes power today.